Hello, and welcome to the Did You Know Crypto podcast. I'm your host, Dustin Dreyfus, and I'm very excited today to be welcoming onto the show one of the heroes of mine in the liberty movement, Mr. Jeffrey Tucker. His article in 2013 called Bitcoin for Beginners was very influential in getting me on board with Bitcoin. It lended a lot of credence coming from somebody in academia. In this episode, we talk about everything from his journey from being a crypto skeptic to being a Bitcoin evangelist, as well as Crypto-Utopianism, a lot of stuff on economics. I really think that you're going to get a lot out of this episode. So why don't we delve right in? And thanks for listening. I'd like to welcome Jeffrey Tucker, Editorial Director for the American Institute for Economic Research, Chief Liberty Officer at Freedom.me, founder of the Atlanta Bitcoin Embassy, and author of countless articles and books, including his latest called The Right-Wing Collectivism, The Other Threat to Liberty. Mr. Tucker, welcome to the show.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
I have to say it's also a great pleasure to speak with you. Actually, I missed you at the LP convention in Madison this year. Due to the Yeah, the snowstorm kept us from driving south that way. So, but I really appreciate you taking your time to come on the podcast. And before we kind of get more into the Bitcoin side of it, I kind of want to talk about your early life. You know, what kind of drew you to economics as sort of your vocation?
Well, I was a musician, actually. It's so funny because my beloved father always wanted me to be a musician, so he trained me from a very early age and to be a trombonist. And I was very, very good. So by the time I was in 7th or 8th or 9th grade, I would go darn good. And by the time I was a sophomore in high school, I was actually like on the verge of like everyone in Texas thought I was the next greatest trombonist in the world. It was that kind of thing, you know? So like I had some great trombonists fly in order to train me so they could say that they were my teacher. I mean, it was crazy. And I was playing at the Texas Tech Trombone Ensemble as a junior in high school and touring with the Guy Lombardo Orchestra and just doing all this stuff. And it was my life. It was all I knew. And then one day I woke up and I thought, so I was maybe 17 at this time, maybe 16, 17. And I was like, I don't know. I mean, everybody's told me I was supposed to do this one thing. Maybe I should do something else. And I had a chance for a fresh start because I was going to college. And I didn't like the music world that much because I loved music, but I didn't like the people in it because they were really against the consumer. They were the most disgruntled, dour crowd I'd ever seen. And I didn't like hanging around them because they were always down on the audience and down on the world and down on everything. And they just wanted to play their own nonsense, and they were against consumer culture, and I just something dreary about it. I just couldn't. I didn't want to be there, and I certainly didn't want to be there for the whole of college. So I went around from department to department looking for some major that I could have, some kind of interest I could have that wasn't music. Because it was like, that great moment in life where it's like a blank slate. You're like, oh, wait, I can do anything I want. I can shape my own life. And so I bumped into the economics department, which I didn't know what economics was, but it's as the head of the department explained it to me, that through economics you could understand why nations rise, why they fall, why people are prosperous, whether they're poor, how wealth works, where it comes from, how it's created. And I thought, wow, that's everything I care about. So I became an economics major and just threw myself into it. The conventional kind of economics, like straight out Keynesianism, was what was being taught to me. And I liked it more or less. But then I ran into this sort of alternative school of thought, which was more about stories about human beings actually engaged in the world. And I got really enraptured by, the work of Hans Helmholtz and Ludwig von Mises. And then eventually I met Murray Rothbard. We were good friends for 10 years. And then I helped to build Mises.org and went on to restart Laissez-Faire Books and work at the Foundation for Economic Education. And I'm a little bit of a restless person, I have to say, but, and restless people are a little bit scary. It's like you have to always ask yourself, wait, am I going to get bored of this thing that I'm doing right now and have this undying desire to move on to something else? Like, for example, I wrote a book about medieval polyphony, and I became like, a fairly well-known conductor of Gregorian chant around the world and commentator on that subject and everything. But I got bored of it, So, I mean, that's just one of thousands of weird interests I've had. But for some reason, economics and the dynamic of freedom and what that means in the world is always... it's captivated me my entire life. I'm 54 years old right now, and I'm just as enraptured as I was when I was 20, with the whole topic. So, which is not to say I know more, but I keep learning more, and I always have this sense that I'm going to find the thing that makes it all make sense to me. And so maybe that's what keeps it going. People say it's a science, maybe it's not. I don't know, but it's a fascinating subject, and I can't stop thinking about it. I can't stop writing about it.
And I think that restlessness is probably, I'm guessing, what kind of piqued your interest in Bitcoin and kind of that love of complexity.
But what's interesting to me about Bitcoin is what it meant for me intellectually, because it was a humbling moment for me. Because when I first heard about it, I thought, well, there's all kind of reasons why the theory that I have would say that this thing cannot work and it's not real. And I dismissed it. I have full email archives going back to 2010 where I was just like, this is nonsense. You can't make money by clicking on a computer. This is alchemy. This is a bunch of naive computer programmers who don't understand monetary theory and so on. And I really got it. I was sure that it was not real, and that it kept growing and growing and growing over the next 2 or 3 years. And I finally found myself, fully engaged in the topic and in the physical ownership in early 2013, and because Bitcoin was so compelling, and when it was initially compelling to me, it was I recall, it was like $14. I realized that there was something wrong with my whole social epistemology. Like I thought because I was smart, I knew more than, I don't know, the market or the distribution of creators and innovators around the world, entrepreneurs. Like I knew what could be and what couldn't be, and I was certain this could not be. And then I discovered that it could be, and it shocked me, and it really changed my outlook on life. I was like, oh well, if I didn't know that, what else don't I know? And it really kind of kicked off a new period for me in my intellectual life. Just a sense of exploration and realization that I didn't know everything, and I began to approach everything I read and everything I wrote about differently after that, actually. And even to this day, I mean, I think I wrote an article maybe a week ago or something like that. It was about green stamps and money-like things. Just the weird sense that there's not some sort of black and white picture. It's not either money or not money. That everything, like a ton of things, are moving between the two. There's degrees of moneyness, and I'm fascinated by that, and I'm intrigued by it. I write about it just constantly because I'm so interested in this. And there's nothing about Bitcoin, of course. I mean, just the idealism behind the whole topic. It's like, oh, well, maybe we can make our own money. We don't have to rely on the government. It's a departure from everything I had learned from Murray, who I think was basically wrong on this topic, unfortunately. God bless his soul. But he was wrong on many aspects of the path towards monetary reform. And Hayek turns out to have been more right than anybody else. And I didn't used to believe that. So I literally changed my mind. I mean, like I did a pivot intellectually on a subject that had been really important to my life since I was 21 years old. So, so Bitcoin was for me life changing. It's not just what it is. It's also a symbol of the need for intellectual humility. And I gradually changed my whole outlook on everything between 2000, maybe it was 2011, and going forward. And now I feel like, thanks to Bitcoin, I'm kind of a different person. When I first wrote about the topic, I didn't actually know why Bitcoin worked. I just knew that it worked, And
was that Bitcoin for beginners?
Well, I wrote my first article maybe February of 2013. I was writing for Laissez-Faire Books at the time. And maybe it was Bitcoin for beginners. But my first article was really naive. It was just kind of just a happy article about, wow, I discovered this cool new thing, and who can make any sense of it? I don't know. It was that kind of article. I keep meaning to look back at that and sort of fisk it and examine, what I got right and what I got wrong. If I got anything wrong, I don't really know. Because like I say, I didn't know why it worked. And so the next year I was spent, trying to unravel what I thought I knew and figure out where my brain went wrong. Why is Bitcoin valuable? How does it work? What is this thing we call cryptography? Why does a peer-to-peer distributed network actually assist in the facilitation of the creation of money? What are the prospects? What is Bitcoin? What makes Bitcoin different from PayPal? I was like, none of those questions I could actually answer in the early of 2013, but by a year later, I could answer them all. So it was real intellectual journey for me. So and so here we are in 2018, which is not that much long after Bitcoin was actually invented. And I'm pretty patient with people that dismiss it and say, oh, it's a bubble, it's a this, it's a that, it's just used for drug dealers, whatever. It's a money laundering scam. Because I know the difficulties of understanding it, and I know what it's like to be bitten by the bug, and to see the vision and to imagine a future that's very unlike the past. So I always try to be patient with people. It doesn't surprise me at all how much incredulity there is out there.
And I think people kind of forget now. I guess you don't really want to call it ubiquitous in the culture. It's at least people know the name of it, which is a real big accomplishment, right? From 3-4 years ago. But early on, I got actually involved in 2013. Actually, your article is one of the first I've been reading on forums, but like an actual academic, or more than just some Bitcoin Talk forum or something on Wired magazine. And that was one of the first articles I really read that kind of made me go, hey, maybe this is more than I was interested in it. I liked the idea, but the credence that someone like yourself, who was actually part of the academic structure, lended a lot of credence to it. But for someone like me, I was talking about it with my family, and everyone just thought it was kind of a goofy thing. A lot of them still do, probably, even if they're listening right now. And that's not like a real big deal, because I've had a lot of goofy ideas throughout my life, right? So, but for someone like you, and I mean, basically your entire field and all your peers were probably at best dismissive of it, if not outright hostile to the idea.
I had no idea what I was doing when I wrote my first article. It was truly like the ceiling fell in on me. Everybody was against me. All my peers were dismissing me. They thought I would fall in for a hoax, that I was gullible and idiot who didn't understand my theory well. And I faced like an unbelievable amount of trolling even 5 years ago. And I got scared. I mean, I did. I thought, wow, maybe I am an idiot. Maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. Maybe I have fallen for a hoax. I mean, that literally was what happened to me in those days. It was scary. And I thought, wow, I've worked, 20 years, 25 years really, to build up a career and a reputation. And now I've thrown it all away on this dumbass magic internet money. What have I done? I didn't know for sure, but basically I tried to stay honest with myself and say what I thought was true, even if it wasn't true. I felt like I had an obligation as an intellectual and as a public intellectual, really, to say to write what I thought was true, even if I didn't know for sure it was true. And it turned out well for me in a way, but I'm not sure why. And it was a very scary moment, really, ultimately. And I understand the temptation of intellectuals to want to go along with what's already known, to hide behind the great thinkers, to embed your thought into a school of thought, so you're not exposed, and so that you're just part of a community, and you're not out there on a limb, so nobody can cut you off. And I suddenly found myself out on a limb, and it was scary. It was a scary thing for me, actually, because I felt like I'd worked really hard for my reputation, and I almost inadvertently felt like I was sort of sacrificing everything for the sake of this crazy thing, and it scared me because people were really blasting me. I mean, I was being trolled so hard by people I respect, and at that point, the Bitcoin community was very kind to me because, I was, to my mind, a little bit late to the subject. So there was already all these people out there that really believed in it, like Eric Voorhees and Charlie Shrem and these guys who were, Roger Ver, I think, was already all in. So they became kind of my new friend circle because they understood what I was going through. And they weren't quite very sophisticated money people like I thought of myself as one. So I was kind of at that point in history, the most high-end monetary theorist, I guess you could say, who endorsed, this crazy idea. And it was genuinely scary. Within the next 12 to 24 months, more people got involved, and ultimately, now I'm just like a normal dude or whatever. But back in those days, it was really scary.
Yeah, I think even now, though, it still is quite strange for most people. I mean, they read the Forbes articles and CNBC Fast Money, which is actually a bad idea on CNBC wise, but I still think it is still kind of a weird thing. But
Yeah.
But I guess not as much. It really changed over the last year. It really kind of burst onto the public consciousness in 2017, more due to price than actual understanding.
You know what's funny about that, though? Can you still hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so what's funny about that is that in a way, we've crossed into a new era. The people who have made their reputations based on debunking Bitcoin are refuse to see the reality that they were wrong. So they get actually more entrenched than ever. And all good news is bad news. All bad news they consider to be confirmation of what they believed. And so people have really gone into their respective corners on the whole topic. And I deal with these people every single day. And it gets a little tedious, because I was there at one point. I was the greatest skeptic there was. And, maybe 2010, 2011, I was deeply dismissive of the whole thing. So I kind of get them, but also I think they've all been proven wrong. And I find it just kind of amazing that there's still people out there that dismiss the whole topic. Oh, you can't make money on the internet. This is all just nonsense. And I've found that very few are willing to change their minds based on the evidence at all. So what I've started doing is just started giving Bitcoin to people, actually. Because quite often what happens is that the skeptics feel as if they've missed out, and they're kind of engaged in self-justifying behavior. They're like, "Oh, I missed out on Bitcoin, so now I have to dismiss it and constantly attack it." And so when you give them Bitcoin, they suddenly feel in a sense of personal investment in the whole topic, and it shuts them up. That's why I do it. Even if it is, you can do it with like $2. It doesn't matter. $2, $1, $10. Just make a person a stakeholder in the industry, and they start to change their minds.
Yeah, it was kind of funny. You were talking about how you're the biggest skeptic. It kind of sounded like a very Paulian road to Damascus sort of story.
Kind of, yeah. And like I say, it was about more than just discovering that Bitcoin was real. I discovered that I didn't know everything, and it drew me into a different way of thinking, and I got much more interested in. I love Mises. I love my mentor Murray very, very much, but they also were rationalists in many ways, and people don't believe it, but the libertarian world is filled with rationalism. People think they know the right way that everything's supposed to work. And that perspective ultimately became unsatisfying to me, and so I got more and more drawn to Hayek and the traditional philosophy he represents, and began to understand a little bit more about uncertainty, about process, about the gradual unfolding of the market, revealing things to us that we didn't think were possible. And I don't know. I just became, I felt like I went to a different level. Once an intellectual decides, realizes, oh, I don't know everything. That's a big moment.
Well, would you? Oh, there's a little bit of feedback in there. I don't know if there's something scratching the mic.
Maybe I was just picking up my bow tie. How about now?
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
No, that's fine. I think. Would you say that a lot of the pushback, especially from mainstream economists, would be due to the fact that most mainstream economists are of the kind of the Keynesian school, and I really don't feel that Bitcoin would ever come into existence out of a group of people that had kind of the Keynesian mindset. I mean, it would make absolutely no sense that you would do something.
Oh, so for sure. I mean, if you go back and look at the history of thought, you can see that there was a book that came out in something like 1906 called "The State Theory of Money" by. You can look it up. But the Keynesians are really dedicated to this idea that only government can produce money, and that anything not produced by government is not real, it's not stable. And this is a very important thing. I mean, like a lot of 20th century macroeconomics is bound up with the idea of controlling the money supply as a mechanism to manipulate the macroeconomic environment. And that requires, like, how do you control the money supply? You have to control the banks, you have to print the money, you have to have a monopoly on money, all the money has to go through a regulated banking system, and so on and so on. That is the state theory of money. So yeah, guys like Paul Krugman can't and will not ever come around to the topic. I mean, it's like they look at it like, look, if you let go of the money, if money is going to be produced purely privately, the intellectuals and their friends in the political world will ultimately lose all the power, and they can't stand that. They can't stand that possibility. It's so terrifying to them. So they'll never come around. I mean, that's just the reality. I mean, that they can't and won't come around.
No, it's Austrian economics was just so pivotal to Bitcoin's creation, because I mean, even Satoshi was talking in one of the forum posts. There's one talking about Mises regression theorem that he participated in,
really?
and there was a topic on Bitcoin Talk asking whether or not Bitcoin met Mises regression theorem of money, and he kind of came to the defense of it. So I mean, we never explicitly stated it and said, I am a libertarian who believes in the Austrian school of economics, whether, the different flavors of that might be. But I don't think you can escape that it was at least aware and heavily influenced by it to come up with something like that.
There's no question. I mean, and to give Murray credit, because Murray was actually, in some sense, the worst on this topic. I mean, he really thought that there could never be a new money, that the dollar had to be reformed. And that was his path to reform. And Mises himself was an old-fashioned gold standard guy, and a minimal statist, in the sense that he believed in a small state, but that the job of the state was to define the money and defend that monetary system, which he believed was a gold standard. But there's one sense in which Murray's vision actually informed Bitcoin, and it has to do with his whole view concerning property rights, actually. And he thought that banks were the major violators of people's property rights. Like you give them deposits, they mixed all the deposits, they would overextend credit, and then endanger themselves as a business and go run into the state to bail them out, And so that's why Murray believed in a 100% reserve system. And there's a way in which the protocol of Bitcoin itself kind of embodies that Rothbardian vision, actually. It's very interesting.
What do you think that, because I know that Rothbard was very critical of Hayek's idea of the private issuance of currencies, but if Rothbard were still alive today, if he had seen the rise of Bitcoin, do you think that he would, I would imagine he would have to change his mind on this topic. He was not against that.
You're very sweet to ask that question. And as you might suspect, it's an impossible question to answer because Murray died in 1995. And that was really, in some ways, before the digital era really became a thing. He never used email, ever. 1995 email was still a little bit weird. He did like the fax machine, actually. He would pound out his manuscripts and fax them to the office, and he liked it, and he was enraptured by it. But he was never a techno guy, really. And the other thing is, Murray was really, really against Hayek's vision of denationalized choice in currency. So there's a lot. It's really interesting to speculate if Murray would have come around because, like I say, he died in 95. But Murray was also a very agile intellectual. So, at this point, we're really entering into pure speculation about what he would have been willing to change his mind on. He did change his mind a lot of times. Mostly he changed his mind on tactics, not so much on theory. And this would have required a fundamental theoretical change. I do know that he had done that in the course of his life. I guess I tend to think that Murray would not have come around on Bitcoin, actually, if I were going to guess, only because it's really hard to say. It depends on who had his ear, how much patience he could have had for listening to the explanations. I just don't know. I think I would tend to give Murray credit for being more agile than his followers today, who look at his written work as some sort of canon, and I don't think that's the right way to look at Murray. But whether he would have come around or not, it's really hard. It's hard to say. But there's no question that Murray's own writings had a huge influence on the creation of Bitcoin, and Hayek, and Kerzner, and Menger, and a lot of other people from the Austrian tradition. I think the Austrian tradition of Bitcoin are really inextricably linked at some level. But it's very difficult to talk about that because, neither Hayek nor Menger nor Murray nor Mises, none of these people, nor Kerzner, had really come of age in a digital era. And part of the difficulty of Bitcoin is understanding the value of digits, the productivity and economics of the digital world. And none of these guys ever really had it. They were never really part of that. Nowadays, you think about their successors, and I think of them as basically Larry White, George Selgin, the Sound Money Project associated with AIER, and so on. they're all just really super interested in cryptocurrency and fascinated by the topic. So none of them are Bitcoin maximalists, by the way. But yeah, so but I would say they're more inclined to look at Bitcoin as something to think about seriously. In any case, I would love the idea of Murray coming around the topic. I mean, there's a lot of things like anybody who knew Murray thinks about him all the time. Like, what would Murray be saying or doing today? And we all disagree with each other, you know. I mean, my good friend Walter Block and I disagree just like profoundly and fundamentally on so many things, and yet we both think we're channeling Murray, you know. So, yeah. So that's kind of the sort of figure that he was. He was just a giant in history, and nobody who knew him or was impacted by him, you know, today even we like every single day we think about him. You know, what would Murray do? What would Murray think? And nobody really knows. You know, it's part of the frustration.
To get kind of just the last question of in regards to Austrian economics, to get further deep, you know, into the weeds is
that's okay.
I was listening to your debate on Naomi Brockwell's show with Gene Epstein,
yeah,
in regards to the you know, how you actually, you know, believe that Mises regression theorem, that Bitcoin doesn't meet it.
I do,
and I thought that was really interesting as well, because you attributed to a mistranslation, while Bob Murphy was also kind of almost in a way doing the same thing, but in kind of a different way, where he was saying that it doesn't meet it because it's not credit money. It wasn't a commodity prior to being adopted as money, although I think that the service of blockchain actually can meet that. But he also contends that fiat itself was a mistranslation of the word signed money, and that Bitcoin itself could be considered a signed money. So he actually contends that it's a fiat. I don't agree.
That's all nonsense. I love Bob, but that's just nonsense. Yes. Credit was a mistranslation. The right word is fiduciary media, which you rendered as side money, or I would just simply say money substitute. That's all fascinating and interesting, but I don't think that's what Bitcoin is. I think Bitcoin is actually money. It really is money, which, according to the early definition of Mises in his book, what, you know, maybe this is a pedantic question, but you know, it always seems to come back to it. What is money? And Mises finally decided, after this long treatise, which is definitely worth a read right now, Theory of Money and Credit, or Theory of Money and Fiduciary Media, really is the correct word. But what Mises said is that money is the thing that you acquire not to consume, but in the anticipation that it can be traded for something else that is in fact a consumable good. So you acquire it not for consumption purposes, but in anticipation that it can be traded for consumption goods later. So it facilitates indirect exchange. Then he had another descriptive proviso that money it tends to be the commonly accepted medium of exchange, so that you don't acquire it just for your own sake because you think that it can be traded later for something you want to consume, but you believe that other people are going to do the same. So there's an element of common acceptance, you know, that becomes part of the observable definition of money. So there's two parts to this. One is, what are your intentions, and then what becomes the empirical reality. And with regard to Bitcoin, I would say that certainly in the first instance, it is money. You're acquiring it because you believe that it can be accepted later. You acquire it not to consume it, but with the expectation that it can be traded for something consumable later. So use value becomes really important in that Misesian definition of money. Whether it's commonly accepted or not, I feel like it is commonly accepted in some respects, but it's but not in every respect, And the state's making it as difficult as possible, actually, to achieve that second level of moneyness. So at some level, I'm happy to describe it as a money-like thing. I don't want to get into debates with people, but I definitely do think it does, in some circumstances of time and place, serve as money. In other respects, it's not. So that's why I would look at it right now.
Yeah, so I always find these kind of internal debates really.
Oh, it is fascinating. And as for the regression theorem, I mean, that's a funny topic because this was Mises's theory. He didn't make a big deal out of it. By the time that I think it appears on like chapter 7 or something, like the 15th paragraph of one chapter, and it only lasts like two paragraphs in his book. So Mises didn't think it was a very interesting point, but his point was that the circularity of use value, marginal utility, and price is ultimately ended in the case of Bitcoin. And that's where the word regression comes from, because you're going back in time, back in time. The price is a marginal utility, the marginal utility is a price. And so it's like, well, what was the initial value of money? And Mises says, well, the initial value of money traces to its value as a bartered commodity. Which, and in his earliest book, he says, and that bartered commodity has use value in itself. Okay, so that's the passage I seized on to argue that Bitcoin does satisfy all the conditions of the regression theorem, because it in fact does have use value, but the use value itself is due to the blockchain technology, which allows the transference of immutable information bits peer to peer in a way with that provides an uncrackable sort of audit trail, and that's never been possible in the history of the world. So that itself is an awesome service, and that service use value becomes then embedded in the mathematical numeraire of Bitcoin itself. So in that sense, it does work. Now, there's one sense in which it doesn't work, and that is that in the Misesian rendering of history, money obtains the value, literal price that it once had as a bartered commodity, whereas when Bitcoin obtained its value, it started at 0 and immediately went to a 16th of a penny on October 5th, 2009. So it didn't have a pre-existing value in barter, but it did have a use value, which you can observe by the fact that there were about 100 transactions per day between the Genesis block and October 5th. And you have to ask yourself, why were these transactions taking place in a zero price world? And I think the answer is that people were just fascinated by the technology. And don't forget, it was released as an open source technology, so blockchain services could not have obtained a price at all. Like, it was actually impossible for them to obtain a price because it was released as an open source protocol. So the way I look at that is like the pricing of the bartered commodity and its use value is historically contingent, and Mises couldn't imagine a bartered commodity being traded at zero price because there was no such thing as a distributed network released into the commons in 1912. Like, we didn't know what that even meant. So, yeah, you have to tweak the theory a little bit, but I still feel like it satisfies all the conditions that Mises laid out. And you know what's funny about this whole debate? And thank you for bringing it up. I mean, it's such a geeky topic, right? But, there's like 1 in a billion people who even care about, Mises's regression theorem. And I remember it was something like September, September, November, October, November of 2013, I remember puzzling about this question of the regression theorem and finally deciding, I don't know. I mean, I don't know whether it satisfies those conditions or not. What does it matter? It actually works. It is money. It is the thing. We're dealing peer to peer with an indirect exchange without financial intermediaries. I see it every day. This is happening. Who cares about the theory? I mean, if the theory doesn't work, let's get rid of it. Let's look at the reality. That was very hard for me because I'd always been a theory primacy guy, and suddenly I had to ask myself, what if this thing is not consistent with the theory? What am I going to believe? It's like Groucho Marx said, who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes? I decided to believe my own eyes rather than my theory. So, but 6 months later, I finally, maybe it was a year later, reconciled the regression theorem according to the history of Bitcoin itself. And that was a great moment for me because I could still believe that Mises was correct and also that Bitcoin is true. So yeah. And it's interesting because I think I remember being in late 2014, I was in Australia hanging around with, guys like you and me who were obsessed with all this stuff, right? And we debated for hours the question of the regression theorem, which again, nobody on the planet Earth even cares about except you and me and 12 other guys. And many people were really willing to say, screw the regression theorem. I mean, maybe Mises was wrong. Who even cares? And I guess I never was willing to fully say that because the regression theorem is a story that I've told myself for so long. Actually, I take that back. At that conference, I think I might have been on the side of who cares, forget our theory. We're learning, let's just learn. Don't worry about it. But I think it was later, maybe it was 4 or 5 months later, I finally reconciled the regression theorem with Bitcoin in my own mind, and I wrote several obsessive, pointless articles about the topic just to get it done. And I remember lots of Misesian scholars coming up to me at the time saying, wow, you've really figured this out. Why don't you write your big treatise on this topic for the Journal of Money, Credit, and Banking? And my own attitude at that point was okay, whatever. I mean, nobody reads your stupid journals anyway. I have I have other kind of articles to write, so just forget it. But still, I would defend the relationship between the regression theorem and Bitcoin. Although my colleague at AIR, Will Luther, who's, I don't know, his IQ is it's double mine. I mean, he's just a genius. And I was hanging out at the mansion a couple of months ago, and he was, we're one cocktail deep, and he was explaining to me that he understood my point, and he agreed with me as far as it went. However, and then he made a series of observations that seemed to refute what I was saying, but it was so, I hate to use the word deep, but it was deep. It was several layers beneath where I was thinking, in which he argued that actually it doesn't satisfy the conditions. And I just said, well, look, I don't know what to tell you. I'm stupid. You're smart. Maybe you're right. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I don't care. I don't know. I've got my story. I'm sticking to it. Let's just go on with the evening. So that's sort of what happened. But if he were here with you now, and I would encourage you to get him on the podcast, he would take issue with every one of my claims, actually. So
I was going to actually pivot away kind of from the more economic thing to kind of go into this crypto, I don't know, crypto-utopianism, because you are an incorrigible optimist, which can be kind of a rare thing in the libertarian world. And I feel like I was a little bit too young to witness the end of the fall of the wall and the end of communism. But just from reading a lot of the older articles and things, I feel like people had a real triumph of markets, triumph of capitalism and liberty. And it feels like, that was kind of, historically speaking, quickly dashed. And then there was kind of, it felt like a resurgence of it, of kind of a widespread optimism, at least in our circles, with, in the 2008 Ron Paul campaign, the Bitcoin kind of coming onto the scene. And what is the Jeffrey Tucker case for optimism in the micro and the macro view of the future?
Okay, so let me just kind of march back with everything you just said. I remember those days very well, the fall of communism and everything. And I remember thinking after Russia just like weirdly collapsed. The Soviet Union just dissolved. It went away in Poland. It went away in, the Berlin Wall fell. Ceausescu in Romania was shot. China had reformed dramatically despite Tiananmen Square massacre and so on. There was a real sense that history had changed. And I remember thinking, it's so funny when I look back at those days. I remember thinking, wow, I dedicated myself entirely, my entire career, my entire life, everything I know about myself as an individual has been dedicated to the cause of the free market as versus socialism. And now that debate seems to be settled. I guess I just really, it's possible I can have to move on to a new career. I could go back to school and become an engineer. I could, pick up my trombone and play music again or something. I really, in those days, believed that the world was, like the debate had been settled, basically,
I wish.
Yeah, and I remember going to, I was living on Capitol Hill at the time. There was no internet. But I went to a bookstore and there was a magazine, a socialist publication called Dissent. And because I couldn't wait to see what the socialist had to say about this, right? And like every free market intellectual in the day, I wasn't really in touch with left-wing literature except to the extent it dealt with like foreign policy and the evils of U.S. imperialism and stuff like that. But I didn't really get that basically since the Hitler-Stalin Pact of 1943 or whenever that was, that the left really had no real concern about Soviet Union as such. They didn't believe it was genuine communism. And they thought Stalinism was a version of fascism. So Dissent magazine was actually a journal. Imagine those days when you couldn't find out anything except by going to the bookstore and buying a physical piece of paper. But anyway, so I went to the bookstore and I bought the latest issue of Dissent. I couldn't wait to see how they would account for themselves. And the headline was something like, Stalinism collapses, socialism lives. And I thought, oh, you idiots. That's just the dumbest thing I'd ever heard. And I read the article and it was all about, Stalin had nationalized communism, that he turned Lenin's great vision of universal socialism into a kind of a national fascist project. And if you think about Stalin the right way, he was really a corporate statist, just like FDR and so on. And I remember reading this thinking, okay, you people are absolutely insane. But wow, you sure are confident. You really, you still believe, like there was nothing that happened in those days that shook the confidence of any leftist. And I remember thinking, well, this is issue 1. This is the spring of, what year are we talking about? 2000. No. Yeah. No, it was 80. Yeah, it was 80, 89 and 90 was the year when all this stuff happened, right? So let's say, time goes fast. So let's say it was the spring issue of 1990, something like that. And I thought, well, you people, you've done a valiant effort in trying to save your idiotic ideology. But we'll know, the whole world will in a year or two. And yes, news travels slowly. Socialism will be bankrupt and defunct in a couple of years. And but it was strange. It was like it was like all the ideological camps of the time reoriented themselves to, in a way, to continue to believe what they already believed. It's like it made no difference whatsoever. And here we are in 2018, and the most vocal ideological camps of our time are really not that different from what they were in 1933 or 34. I mean, it's just as if the century had never happened, and the debates are still there all over again. And it's just utterly shocking to me. And I don't entirely know how to account for this, except to say that I guess it's a cliche to say we don't learn from history, but I think there's something even more profound to it than that. It's that we only learn from the things we lived. We only gather lessons from that which we personally experienced and had a stake in. And then we learn from it. But the tragedy of the trajectory of human history is that we can't live at all times in all places. We just don't. We only live in our own times. So the people who didn't live in those times have no memory of it, and any more than you and I remember the Peloponnesian Wars. And studying history is hard. Believing in history is harder. To learn something from that which we never experienced is almost impossible.
You were saying about not learning from history, and as you've called, the kind of the right and left Hegelian ideas, and just the amount of bodies over the last 100 years, how either of those ideals have any sort of traction. And it kind of leads me into that. The next kind of thought that I had, in the crypto-utopian, and I know that it's kind of like pie in the sky, some people would call it, but that, that maybe we haven't learned because we haven't figured out a different way to do it. But with there's that real line of thinking that we don't really understand, Bitcoin as a concept and how much it's going to change society. And I think, the idea of the fork is kind of a really interesting concept to me, because it's less of an economic question. It's more of a political, social one. What we saw with BTC and BCH, right? It was not an economic question. It was a political disagreement in the community about how to implement economic motivators for the protocol to society. And I think that, the political disagreement was rendered moot and unnecessary after the fork. Those who wanted on-chain went to BCH, those who didn't went to BTC. And unlike things with the French Revolution, the revolutions of the political revolutions of history, there was a lot of grudges, but no blood. And I think this is kind of a revolutionary concept of how we can model a society, especially as we move more into the ideas of virtual nations and citizenship.
Let me just say, I think what your thought is a beautiful one. The idea that our conflicts are becoming ever less violent. I mean, it may be not, if you're a Twitter maven, it may not seem that way to you, but actually, but you're exactly right. It's way better to wake up in the morning with 200 trolling tweets on your notifications than it is to have your children's and your mother and your father slaughtered by a revolutionary regime, in France. So yeah, there's no bloodshed. As bad as we think we have it, it's actually a peaceful world. And yeah, the idea of the fork, I do like what you just said, that the fork is a kind of a new peaceful form of revolution. That's really an interesting idea. And there's a number of things that, I have an intuition about everything that's happened to us over the last, say, 20 years, and that's that. We've undergone this great migration away from the material world into the digital world, and we see it every day. I mean, Apple's now got a $1 trillion market cap. Amazon's accepts 32 orders per second, more than $1 billion a year. It's at $1 trillion market cap. I mean, consumer culture and the peace that's associated with that, by which I mean nonviolent exchange, is the prevailing model that is shaping our world today, and I think in so many ways the nation states. Oh, and by the way, these are necessarily global institutions, and cryptocurrency is necessarily global. I mean, there's no currency, there's no trade zones, there's no currency zones, there's no national currencies in the crypto world. Bitcoin in Australia is identical to what it is in Moscow, and so on. This was never before possible in history. I think we talk about disintermediation all the time in the crypto world, but really, what is the ultimate mediator that prevents us from having that sort of peer-to-peer utopia? And the ultimate one is the state itself. And I think that's going to be the greatest victim of the revolution that's happening right now, because it's going to become increasingly obvious that it serves no real purpose, the nation state, anymore. And I think that's why you have the Trumps of this world, because there's a sense of panic. It's like, oh my God, we better stop this now, or there's no future to the thing we believe in most strongly: national identity, dictatorship, strong men ruling the world. Those are all anachronisms. It's all of the past. So I don't think it's a coincidence that all the politics of our time are basically reactionary, whether it's Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump. Everybody's trying to restore something from the past. It's all kind of glorified revanchism, really, and they're furious about the technological march of history and how it's inexorably moving forward and reshaping our lives, and everybody loves it. I mean, people love Trump too. People love Bernie Sanders too, but they love their iPhones even more. Actually, they love the ability to buy their raw walnuts on Amazon at half the price they can get them at the local grocery store. I mean, it's that which we have a very close material stake in the outcomes, which is our primary love. Politics has become like an abstraction, or like a fun drama we engage in. It's like a cultural game that we play, but does it really matter? I mean, I hope the answer to that is no. And I think the long-term answer to that is that it's not going to matter at all.
Well, I think that's actually a great note to end on. It was a great interview. I really appreciate you taking your time out of your day to come in and talk on this podcast with me. And how can people find you?
Sure. I mean, you can I love Twitter. I think Twitter is probably the most open network platform there is. And so I'm Jeffrey A. Tucker on Twitter, and I write every day at American Institute for Economic Research, and a quick Google will dig up everything else. And let me say this too. I'm on a lot of podcasts, and I don't often get a chance to spend 20 minutes talking about the regression theorem. So thank you for indulging me. It's a very high-end venue you've provided, and I like being challenged at that level. So thank you for that. That's very satisfying.
And I'll have a link to all of Jeffrey's stuff in the show notes at didyouknowcrypto.com. And once again, thanks, Jeff.
Okay, my pleasure.